This is Dr. Parikh, and I'm recording part of the lecture for Chapter 15, and this part covers schizophrenia. So here on this first slide, you see a link, and if you click this link, you'll see a video that walks you through the experiences of someone with schizophrenia, and it's based on reports from people who have schizophrenia, and you see some of the symptoms. You see hallucinations, things that aren't really there, like headlines. You see the weatherman talking directly to you. You hear things. You hear thunder when the weather's actually very nice outside. You also hear a lot of voices. And so this is meant to be a good simulation of what it's like to have schizophrenia. Students sometimes find it kind of scary and overwhelming to watch if I don't give them a warning, so fair warning. And there's also, if you look in the notes here, there's also a description of someone who experiences schizophrenia. And it shows how it sort of starts small and gets bigger, and a little bit of how it builds and how it goes through. Let me flip to the right page in my notes. So schizophrenia is a psychological disorder characterized by delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, and diminished inappropriate emotional expression. So when we think schizophrenia, we think of hallucinations and delusions. Hallucinations are perceptions, so seeing and hearing things that aren't really there. And it's not being able to tell what's real and what's not. And to the person who's experiencing them, they may feel a little illogical at the time, they may not. But they sound and look just the same as any other perception. And there's been some evidence that the brain processes these hallucinations the same way as any other sort of visual or auditory stimulation. So we think of the delusions and the hallucinations. Delusions are thoughts that aren't accurate. So it might be things like, I'm the best biker in the world, which would be possible, but not very likely. It might also be a thought that the FBI has recruited me to work with them in identifying codes. Again, it's possible. If you've seen A Beautiful Mind, that's one of the plot points, and at that point in time, there actually were mathematicians who were working with the government to help break codes and do things like that. So it's possible, but it's not actually happening. And then you have things that are bizarre, like I can control the weather with my mind. That's not possible. That's not likely to be true. So you have some delusions like the doctors are trying to poison me through the medication. That's possible. And then you have other things like aliens are probing me every night. Not so much. So we think of those first, but there's also issues with speech. I believe that some of the Khan Academy videos you watched on Blackboard imitated that. I'm not very good at imitating some of the disorganized speech. You can also, in your book, you can read some nice examples of it. But it's words linked together that don't really make sense. It's also emotions that don't really fit. So it might be telling a happy story, but being angry while you're telling it, or laughing while talking about something really sad. So it's a mismatch of emotions. It's difficult to predict emotional responses because they don't really gel with what's normal behavior. It also could be flat emotions, so nothing. We talk about positive symptoms, which are things that are added on, like these delusions or hallucinations. We also talk about negative symptoms, so things that aren't there, like no emotional response. So symptoms of schizophrenia include disturbed perceptions, disorganized thinking and speech. So you see that person's really struggling. It doesn't really make sense what they're saying. And then diminished and inappropriate emotions and actions. There's two different types of schizophrenia that your book talks about. It talks about one being chronic schizophrenia. And usually when we say schizophrenia, this is what we mean. It's someone who has, growing up, there are certain markers that usually you notice when you look back. Things like being kind of withdrawn, usually not doing great with peer relationships. We also see Often there were complications at birth. And then it goes on, and somewhere in the late teens, early 20s, this person starts to have symptoms that interfere with their functioning. So they start having hallucinations and delusions. They may start having trouble at work or at school, and then eventually they sort of meet criteria for the diagnosis. So it's a form of schizophrenia where the symptoms are usually there by late adolescence or early adulthood. And as people age, typically they start having more they're psychotic episodes, psychotic or psychosis, so psychotic episodes or experiences of psychosis, meaning a break with reality. And so they have more of these episodes, they last longer, and they have a shorter recovery time. So people with schizophrenia typically are not having symptoms 24/7 for 20 years straight. It's usually they'll have a period, a few months or, a few weeks, months, maybe a couple years, where they're having a lot of symptoms, and then they go and they're kind of functioning fairly normally for a while. And then the next episode hits and they decompensate. They start having a lot more symptoms. So that's chronic schizophrenia. Acute schizophrenia, on the other hand, is where usually there's a stressful life event, like maybe a death or two in the family, maybe a serious accident, something happens. And then a little bit after that, this person sort of has a breakdown. So it's a form of schizophrenia that can begin at any age, frequently, not always, but frequently in response to an emotionally traumatic event. And so this person has this break with reality. They can't function for a little while, but then they do recover. And typically they have very long periods of normal functioning, of recovery in between episodes, or they may even just have one episode. And you can see here in the PowerPoint, you can see how the brain, there's a few differences. I think in your book it might show you somewhere it's them, like the parts of the brain that light up, but you can also see the structures in the brain even are a little bit different in a brain that has schizophrenia and one that doesn't. Let me see if I can quit that to make that's a little distracting. So I'm just gonna, this is set to play, but I wanted you to be able to see me. Yeah. Oh, goodness. Okay. So we know that for schizophrenia, there's some brain abnormalities. There's some things that are different. So I just showed you some of the structural differences, which is the anatomy. There's also some differences in the brain chemistry, the hormones. We know that dopamine is very connected to schizophrenia. And then we also know in general there's some abnormal brain activity. Genetics and risk. There's a lot of different things that affect your risk. It's very much connected, though, to the genes. So here, this table, you can see if you have an identical twin, someone who shares all of your genes, and that person has schizophrenia, so you're 100% genetically related to that person. You have almost a 1 in 2 chance that you'll have schizophrenia. On the other hand, if you just have a sibling, so a normal sibling that you share about half of your genes with, you have about a 9% chance of developing schizophrenia. So it's, or a 1 in 10 chance. And so any family members you have with schizophrenia do increase your risk, only biological though. Having a spouse with schizophrenia, your risk is a little higher. My guess is that people with schizophrenia are more likely to seek each other out. It could also be that they're both sharing stressful life events that might trigger the genes, which I'll talk about in just one moment. But you see that it's not 100, even if you have the same genes, it's not 100%. If this disorder was not at all genetically related, we would see 1s and 2s all the way down here. But if it was completely genetically related, we would see 100% here, we would see 50% here, 25% here. We would see a much stronger pattern if it was only the genes. Instead, one thing about genes is that you don't necessarily express every gene that you have. So there's the genotype, what you're born with, but there's also what you express, or your phenotype. We know that things that happen right around birth or in early childhood can affect those genetic expressions. And so when we think about risk, we know that it's related to the parents who gave birth to you, not the parents who raised you. So having an adopted parent with schizophrenia, for example, would not raise your risk of schizophrenia, only having a biological parent. We also know that it's not just one gene, it's a lot of genes, and we're not sure exactly how those genes work together. But we know that whether they are expressed depends a lot on what you experience. So you could have two people born with the same genetic risk. One person has a pretty good life, they don't develop schizophrenia. The other person has a lot of stress factors. Maybe they're born in poverty, maybe their mom didn't have great nutrition during pregnancy, maybe there's some problems at birth and they have oxygen cut off for a little bit. Maybe they grow up in a stressful, chaotic house. Maybe they're placed into foster care a few times. We know being separated from parents can be a risk factor. And 20 years later, that person is showing signs of schizophrenia. Even though they both started with the same genetic risk, one person with the good environment may not get it. One person with the stressful environment may develop schizophrenia. When we look back, we see warning signs, and you'll hear a lot of these are fairly generic, and so we can't necessarily pinpoint at 7 years old who's going to go on to develop schizophrenia. But once we see who has schizophrenia, we can look back, and these signs are often there. So one is social withdrawal, not spending time with other kids, or other sort of odd behaviors. We also know that having a mother with severe and long-lasting schizophrenia is a warning sign. That's going to be in large part due to genetics. There could be some potentially environmental stuff there. Having birth complications, so problems at birth, maybe part of it being separated from parents. We see kids who go on to develop schizophrenia, they have often short attention spans and really kind of odd muscle control. That may be partly from the dopamine. So they're not very coordinated as kids. They tend to be either disruptive or withdrawn. They have a lot of behavior problems, and they have a lot of emotional unpredictability. It's tough to tell what's going to set them off, what's going to make them happy versus sad. It just doesn't make sense intuitively how they respond emotionally to things. They don't play well with other kids. They're more likely to be playing off by themselves. And another warning sign is childhood physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. Now, this is a really important concept in psychology. Predictor does not mean cause. So we know that it's a warning sign if a kid has gone through this type of abuse. And it's easy to say, well, it must be something about this abuse that makes a kid develop schizophrenia. And there's kind of a logic to that it's a very stressful event. That stress might change some of your genes, and so that may lead to you having schizophrenia when you wouldn't have had it otherwise. But it's also possible that the kids who were on the path to schizophrenia already, that there was something about them that perpetrators could pick up on that made them an easier target for physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. It could also be, remember, these things run in families, and the people most likely to abuse you are the people who are in your family. And so it could be that there are family members with other sorts of issues that are abusing, and then also that's leading to a chaotic environment that triggers schizophrenia later. And so it could be actually a cause. It could also be something that's just kind of going along with it for other reasons. And so you have to be very cautious when you're talking about cause and effect. It's very easy to see relationships of cause and effect, but it's also easy to think of, when you're motivated to think of ways, it's easy to think of ways that it might be different. But often once we have a pet theory, we just kind of go along with that. I thought there was more, but that is what I wanted to say about schizophrenia. I will talk a little bit more in class, and we'll talk a little bit in class. I'll answer any questions, and we will be good to go. Thanks.